Thank you, Mary Pat, for that really, for me, touching introduction. I think it was last Christmas. I was sitting home over Christmas break and preparing to give a talk on education, and I picked up the St. Jerome's Plan and read back through it for the first time in a couple of years. And I sat and I thought to myself, when I'm gone, this is what I want my kids to read so that they'll know, what we wanted for them. And St. Jerome's means a great deal, both the parish and the school and the people who work there, to all of us. So I'm grateful for that. That really means a lot to me. And I'm grateful for the invitation to be back here. I was at this conference so thank you, Andrew and Mary Pat. I spoke at this conference a couple of years ago, and it's astonishing to see the growth and the vitality of this. I think we can call it a movement. And so I'm really gratified to be here and appreciate your attention. It's commonplace on occasions such as this to lament the educational crisis afflicting our nation and our children. I trust that most of you in this room could recite the critiques by heart. Contemporary education is too pragmatic and utilitarian, with the ironic result that it often fails to provide students even with the basic skills that it claims to promote. It is too fixated on technique and now on technology, as if thinking meant learning how to do things with an iPad. Apropos of a society that cannot agree on what a human person is, much less what education is for. Contemporary education often lacks for coherent, substantive content, and thus fails to provide students either with the gripping existential questions that form the Western intellectual inheritance, or the philosophical, literary, and artistic patrimony that is their birthright. Too often, in fact, education in our society consists in rigorously not thinking about these questions, or reducing this inheritance to a mishmash, lest we violate the sacred canons of pluralism and multiculturalism. Little wonder, then, that students are often so listless about their own educations when education itself is often confused with ignorance. And in these tumultuous times especially, schools increasingly function as laboratories for social experimentation and for whatever false and dangerous ideology happens to be in fashion or politically ascendant, and so on, and so on. All of those critiques, I think, are true enough. Yet the last few years have made it abundantly clear that our educational crisis is but one aspect, albeit an essential one, of a much broader and deeper civilizational crisis. There is little agreement as to just what this crisis consists in, and one suspects that contemporary culture, having abandoned theology and philosophy for economics, sociology, and journalism, lacks the intellectual and spiritual wherewithal to apprehend its true meaning in any great depth. Nevertheless, its symptoms are obvious and ubiquitous. Just think of the radical changes that have transpired in our culture in such a very short time. We have seen the state assert its authority to redefine the fundamental realities of human nature: man, woman, mother, father, child, with nary a serious thought as to what is really at stake. The significance of this extends well beyond the unprecedented expansion or exertion of state power. We cannot tinker with these fundamental realities of human nature without at the same time affecting everything else. And so this requires a new morality, new notions of justice, new natural and social archetypes, and in fact, a new language, the proliferation of pronouns. We've seen this new cultural orthodoxy rigorously enforced through an omnipresent social media system that has come to dominate contemporary life. This has made possible new forms of systematic coercion, independent of individual intent and without individual responsibility, operating prior to and outside of any pronouncement of the law. And this is but one aspect of a broader technological revolution that has taken on a life of its own. Technology can no longer be thought of merely as a tool that can be put to good or bad uses. It has become instead a regime of necessity, that determines the exigencies of our thought and action and profoundly reshapes its users, as we learned last night, down to our very neurology. It has become for us, in the words of the Canadian philosopher George Grant, a kind of fate. 15 years ago, none of us even knew that we needed or wanted an iPhone or a smartphone. Now they have transformed every facet of life, and none of us is free not to take up some sort of stance in response to them for ourselves and for our children. It is a necessity. The tragic irony of all this is that in elevating individual freedom to the highest good, liberal society has left citizens of all social classes and political persuasions atomized and alienated. Many individuals feel themselves to be at the mercy of forces that they are powerless to withstand or to do anything about. Social solidarity seems to be dissolving. The institutions of civil society are weaker than they have ever been. Many are failing, and people, especially young people, do not trust them anyway. Whole regions of the country feel that they have been left to die. The sense of anger and despair provoked by this social upheaval is surely one factor in the astonishing election of 2016 and the social disintegration that is its aftermath. None of us knows for certain what the future holds, but it would be unsurprising to look back in a few years and see that the political year 2016 was simply the first in a series of ever more violent pendulum swings between political extremes. All of which is to say, and again I think we received some powerful confirmation of this last night, that our children are inheriting a very different world from the one that we grew up in. A brave new world for which there are few signs and no roadmaps. A world in which few of the customs and institutions that we have relied upon for order and stability and meaning, the verities of democracy and patriotism, the sturdiness of social institutions and customs, even the unity and intelligibility of the church's witness, can be taken simply for granted. Apparently, even their own natures as young men and women, and thus the basic categories through which they apprehend reality, are no longer to be trusted. It is a world in which social disintegration coincides paradoxically with breathtaking technological advance. And this is surely not accidental, and it's surely one of the reasons why our civilizational crisis remains to so many incomprehensible and unrecognized. Notwithstanding Trump, who is a bit of a problem, the view from Palo Alto or Northwest DC or the Upper East Side has never been better. The world our children are inheriting is, as we learned last night, a world without silence, and so mostly without thought. Or rather, a world where thought itself is reduced to scientific and technical proficiency. It is a world in which we are subject to the constant thrumming of noise and the relentless bombardment of images, reinforcing the message that our brave new world is, in fact, the only world. There is no world, according to these images, above or outside the world of money, politics, technology, sports, and celebrity. Any NPR listener can attest to this. And this world is inescapable. Any unwilling consumer of gas station TV, or airport TV, or clinic TV, or taxicab TV can attest to this, as can any parents who let their children out of the house. It would be impossible to erect an impermeable barrier against this brave new world, even if such a thing were desirable, and even if you decline to let your children wear a smartphone as a prosthetic attachment. It can all seem rather suffocating at times, which is a sign that we are entering into what the Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce and others have called a new totalitarianism. This is a hard notion for Americans to swallow, admittedly. It seems a little obscene to throw around a word like that, given our prosperity and given the security that we enjoy compared to earlier times and other parts of the world. And it certainly seems incompatible with the many freedoms that we quite obviously enjoy. But let me explain what, in Del Noce's mind at least, makes the new totalitarianism new, and why it is more effective, if obviously less violent, than older forms of authoritarianism. And even if we cannot quite accept the word, the term, let's at least take this diagnosis seriously in order to better understand what's truly at stake in the question of education. By totalitarianism, Del Noce does not mean the dictatorial rule of an all-powerful state. Indeed, the state is but one of the mechanisms of enforcement, and perhaps not even the most important. Totalitarianism refers instead to the absolutization of technological and political order as such. Their power to determine the horizon of our vision, of our thought and action, and thus their power to define the totality within which we live and move and have our being. This power is diffused throughout the institutions of our liberal and technological society, and it operates, in a sense, by negation, by eliminating or attempting to eliminate every form of transcendence. The transcendence of nature over history, the transcendence of truth over pragmatic function, the transcendence of eternity over time, and of course the transcendence of God over creation. Every form of transcendence, save one, that is. For once real transcendence is eliminated or suppressed, technological and political order itself becomes the transcendental horizon, that beyond which we cannot see, that which assumes sovereignty over nature, truth, and morality, over anything that would precede, exceed, or limit it. Technological and liberal order thus becomes absolute precisely in the name of defending freedom. Now you will notice a striking resemblance between the new totalitarianism of Del Noce and the dictatorship of relativism foreseen by Benedict XVI. Its essence consists not in the abolition of rights, and in fact, recent years have shown that it is perfectly compatible with the endless proliferation of rights, but rather in the abolition of truth. The reduction of reason itself to scientific and technical expertise, and the reduction of truth to technological possibility. Del Noce calls this scientism. And within the scientific conception of nature, knowledge, and truth, ultimate questions cannot even be intelligibly posed, much less answered. Have you ever noticed, and it's striking when you do stop to notice it, that there is no such thing as a profound question in American public life? Which means, of course, that we deal with profound things stupidly. Why is that? It's a remarkable thing. And I would venture that there are many reasons, no doubt, but I would venture that part of it has to do with the fact that there is a severe thoughtlessness at the very heart of our most authoritative forms of reason. The crisis of reason is promoted by what we now think reason is. This is why we could reinvent human nature and codify it in law with virtually no serious thought or public discussion about what this would really mean. And it's why the new totalitarianism is arguably more effective, if less violent, than earlier forms of absolutism. Because in a perfectly absolute society, one whose rule was indeed total, no one would ever know that he was being coerced. There would simply be truths that could no longer be perceived, ideas that could no longer be thought, experiences that could no longer be had, and no one would ever know what he was missing. Heirs to no past and unable to perceive eternity, we thereby become perfect prisoners of the present and of whatever fate awaits us in our technological future. When viewed in this light, I'm inclined to agree with my friend Patrick Deneen that the listless ignorance of so many modern students, which is not their fault, is not a failing of the educational system, but its crowning achievement. The, quote, culmination of a civilization that has forgotten nearly everything about itself, and as a result has achieved a near perfect indifference to its own culture. In just a few years' time, we have seen our culture embrace ideas that were unimaginable less than a generation ago. And yet, maybe this new totalitarianism is not really so new after all, but rather the culmination of processes set in motion with the beginning of the modern age. C.S. Lewis seems to have seen into the heart of it more than half a century ago, and his insights cast great light on the urgent educational mission of our own day. I'm not thinking about the abolition of man, which is certainly apropos of our moment in history, and I would strongly encourage you to read or reread or re-reread it again. It's a wonderful and beautiful book. But I'm thinking rather of a less famous book which should be read as its companion, and that is The Silver Chair from the Chronicle of Narnia series. Let me set the scene first, and then we'll come to the heart of the matter, for those of you who might not recall it. Our heroes are two English school children, Eustace Scrubb and Jill Pole, who have been called out of the world by the great lion Aslan to undertake a special quest in the magical land of Narnia. Eustace has been to Narnia once before, where he became friends with Prince, now King Caspian. But you may recall Narnia time is discontinuous with the time in our world. So whereas Eustace is still young, Caspian has now grown very old. The children are charged with finding and rescuing Caspian's son, Prince Rilian, who is being held captive under a spell of enchantment by an evil witch. Aslan gives a series of signs to Scrubb and Pole to guide them in their quest, and which of course they immediately forget. And so their quest is beset by extra hardships that they might not have had to endure had they remembered. Along the way, they are joined in their quest by a marshwiggle named Puddleglum, a strange, grumpy, but good-hearted fellow who proves to be very important. And together they stumble blindly toward their destiny. Fleeing from a city of giants who intended to make them the featured dish at their autumn feast, Eustace, Pole, and Puddleglum fall headlong into an underground kingdom which, though unbeknownst to them, was really their true destination all along. It is a kingdom, Lewis tells us, into which many sink down and few return. There at last they encounter the prince, enchanted by the witch's evil spell. He has forgotten Narnia, in fact, forgotten himself. He no longer knows who he really is. He thinks himself a servant of the witch whom he mistakes for a queen, and announces to Scrubb and Pole his plan to conquer the overworld above in her name. And so the children do not recognize him. They do not know that he is Rilian until they spy him late at night, strapped to a silver chair, the one time of day and the one place where he knows his true identity. When he cries out in the name of Aslan for the children to release him, which was one of the forgotten signs, the children overcome their fear, free the prince, and begin to set out for the world above. But immediately, they run into the witch. Rilian boldly declares to her his true identity and his attention to return to Narnia above. The reader is braced for a violent confrontation. But instead, the witch throws some green powder on the fire, which makes a sweet, drowsy aroma. And she takes out a small instrument, rather like a mandolin, that makes a steady, monotonous, thrumming sound. These made it hard to think, Lewis tells us, and the less you noticed them, the more they got into your brains and blood. This also made it hard to think. The Queen then greets our heroes not with violence, with any obvious violence, but with a dialogue that sounds quite familiar to modern ears. "Narnia," she said, "I have often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. But, dear prince, you are very sick. There is no land called Narnia." Puddleglum and the children leaped to his defense, defiantly informing the witch of the overworld, of the moon and the stars, and the sunlit sky above. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings of the witch's instrument. Jill's mind begins to go hazy. She remembers vaguely the things of her own world, but she could no longer remember their proper names. It all began to seem like a dream. "Yes, it is all a dream," says the witch, always thrumming. "Yes, all a dream," said Jill. "There never was such a world," said the witch. "No," said Jill and Scrub. "Never was such a world." "There never was any world but mine," said the witch. "There never was any world but yours," said they. At this point, Puddleglum joins the fray, declaring that she could never make him forget Narnia. After all, he had been there once. He had seen the stars and the sun and the mountains. Then came the witch's voice, cooing softly like the voice of a wood pigeon from the high elms in the old garden, and it said, "What is this sun that you speak of? Do you mean anything by the word? When you try to think clearly what this sun means, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me that it is like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there is nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. So too with Aslan the lion. I see that we should do no better with your lion, as you call it, than we did with your sun. You have seen lamps, and you imagined a bigger and better lamp and called it the sun. You've seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and it's to be called a lion. 'Tis a pretty make-believe. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from this world of mine, which is the only world. Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you in the real world. There is no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all, and let us begin a wiser life tomorrow." The prince and the two children were standing with their heads down, Lewis writes, the strength all gone from them, the enchantment almost complete. But Puddleglum, desperately gathering all his strength, walked over to the fire. Then he did a very brave thing. He knew it wouldn't hurt him quite as much as it would hurt a human, but he knew it would hurt him badly enough. And so he did it, stamping on the fire with his bare foot. The unpleasant smell of burnt marshwiggle dulled the effects of the witch's sweet-smelling fragrance. And besides, Lewis tells us, there's nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic. With the spell thus broken, Puddleglum rose to speak. "One word, ma'am," he said, "one word. All you've been saying is quite right, I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it, so I won't deny any of what you said. But there's one more thing to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you kindly for our supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, We're leaving our court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's a small loss if the world is as dull a place as you say. Now, C.S. Lewis would have been hard-pressed to imagine our world exactly. With digital technology, I have not had enough coffee yet. The requisite half gallon is... With digital technology and all its little voices insinuating themselves into every nook and cranny of our lives. But otherwise, he depicts a world that is, in its essential respects, very much like our own, and very much like the new totalitarianism prophesied by Del Noce. The witch's insistence that the only real world is the world that can be seen and touched, manipulated, is very close to Del Noce's notion of scientism. It is a world reduced to dumb stuff, without inherent meaning or purpose. The implication that religion is merely a psychological projection, a kind of psychosis, illustrates the fate of religious belief in a scientistic culture, where it is regarded as an expression of psychosis or bigotry. A meaningless world is, by definition, a superficial world, filled with the constant thrumming of noise, which makes it hard, if not impossible, increasingly, to think, especially as it gets into your brains and blood. Puddleglum is surely right to insist that the meaningless world of the witch is indeed a drab, gray, adventureless world with nothing truly great to love, to long for, or to hope in. It's a pretty bleak picture of the witch's world and of ours. Unless, of course, Puddleglum is right, and the true world really is Narnia. If Lewis's underground kingdom points eerily forward toward our own world, it also points back to an older world and indeed an older cave, the cave of Plato's Republic. We should bear in mind that Plato offers his famous allegory of the soul's ascent from shadow to light as an image, and indeed as our oldest archetypal image, of true education, of paideia, of the formation of the soul in the light of the true and the good. And we should also remember that the denizens of Plato's cave are also represented as prisoners, their necks chained so that they can only gaze upon shadows rather than truth. And just as importantly, they are prisoners who have come to love the security of their prison and to scoff at the wisdom that would set them free. Many sink down and few return. The sense of freedom and its relation to truth conveyed in these images, Lewis's and Plato's, is very different from our modern understanding. The modern sense of freedom corresponds to the modern sense of nature as dumb material stuff, devoid of inherent meaning and purpose. There is no place in this vision of the world for the classical understanding of freedom as enjoyment of the highest good, the summum bonum. For our understanding of nature does not permit us to acknowledge the summum bonum or any ultimate end of human life. Good in the modern age no longer names the principle and source of all that is, but rather what we like. And yet without the good, freedom in its positive sense becomes the mere power to act, and in its negative sense, the absence of restraint. But notice that if freedom is merely the absence of restraint, then truth and even nature itself is a threat to my freedom, unless and until it becomes an object of my choice. A life of freedom then too easily becomes a kind of rearguard action against all of those claims that threaten to define me prior to my choosing them. So to be free, I must perpetually show, even if I have to carve it into my flesh, that I, and not God, or tradition, or another human being, or even my own given nature, determine the meaning of my existence or of the sweet mystery of life. Of course, this culminates in nihilism, as we are now quite painfully discovering. But on a traditional view, absence of restraint is a pretty paltry understanding of freedom. A frog acts without restraint. It hops where it will. Yet we would not normally ascribe freedom to it, or at least not a full-blown sense of freedom. Because so far as we can tell, a frog does not deliberate about its reasons for hopping. It hops instinctively in response to immediate stimuli, not because it can be said to understand why it should hop in any given instance, or because hopping expresses any larger purpose or grand design for its life. Human beings, by contrast, are free not simply because we can respond spasmodically to stimuli, but because in our ultimate desire for happiness, we can understand and act and order our lives in accordance with what we take to be good and true. And since a deceived and divided life is ultimately incompatible with this happiness and our desire for it, living out this desire requires the ability to distinguish what is truly good from what merely seems so, and requires the capacity to embrace it wholeheartedly and undividedly. Human freedom, in other words, is more a matter of reason than a matter of sheer will, which means that human freedom depends on truth. It follows that the greater the scope of one's reason, the more one understands the true meaning of things, the freer he can be said to be, even if understanding this truth limits his range of choices. This is why thoughtlessness and freedom are ultimately incompatible. If it is true that intelligence is integral to freedom, then it also follows that a blind or a stupid or an uncomprehending society, a society that cannot really think, cannot be a free society. That's the tragic irony of modern freedom reduced to power. It leaves us entirely at the mercy of whatever powers happen to rule the age. Unless we can see the transcendent horizon of truth beyond the flux of history, we cannot act beyond the apparent necessities of the here and now. This is what it means to say that the truth will set you free. It's not simply that we must be free to pursue the truth, though that is certainly true, nor that we must shape our children's freedom in morally responsible ways, though that is indeed urgent. Rather, it is that truth is the ultimate source of freedom. Without truth, there is no freedom. Conversely, when a man possesses the truth or is possessed by it, he's free, though he may otherwise be powerless to act, because he is always free, at the very least, to suffer on its behalf in witness to it. This is why the liberal arts liberate. All great literature is a gateway to philosophy, an open window into the meaning of things. By encountering the great dramas and characters of the Western literary tradition, Odysseus, Bilbo, Puddleglum, young people are slowly awakened to the vision of life and the great questions of human existence that once animated Western culture. When they begin to encounter these questions and the history of ideas and the thought world of our ancestors, they learn not to judge the world according to the presuppositions of our culture, but to recognize them as presuppositions and to judge them in the light of a timeless wisdom. By carefully observing the lived lives of our fellow creatures, students slowly discover that the mystery of life provokes questions that cannot be satisfied by the reductive answers of modern science. They begin to think philosophically, both about nature and about science itself, its nature and limits, thus entering into a more expansive notion of reason and a richer conception of truth. By encountering the rich treasures of our art and musical tradition, they learn to see, to attend, to abide in things. Ingredients of the wholeheartedness without which it is impossible to pray or to think or to love. One of the interesting things about and implications of the lecture last night, I think, is to reflect on just how catastrophic the loss of our capacity for attention really is. What an important ingredient that is in the most fundamental human acts. Thinking, loving, praying. And one hopes by encountering these treasures, they begin to desire a higher and more exalted way of life than our culture says is possible for them, and to entertain a hope that our world would deny them. And by discovering the synthesis of Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, the spiritual unity that underlies our culture, and the way that it has informed some of the greatest works of human history, and of human thought, and of human creativity, they begin to overcome the separation of faith and life imposed upon them by our aggressive secularism, and to see that culture itself is an order of love, to be judged, in St. Augustine's words, by the quality of the objects of its love. It all sounds so easy, doesn't it? But of course we know that's not the case. It's enormously difficult to form students for a higher kind of life in a culture that makes no distinction between high and low. It's enormously difficult to form the soul in the light of the true order of things in a culture that relentlessly denies that there is a true order of things, and that does not even acknowledge the soul. The way is difficult. Many sink down, few return. No doubt over the next several days you will discuss many very interesting and important things. Different conceptions of classical and liberal education. Interesting and controversial questions. Is classical a method or a content? Are grammar, logic, and rhetoric stages or subjects? How rigorously does one need to adhere to the trivium and quadrivium to consider one's approach classical or liberal? How do we harmonize the study of mathematics and the study of nature with our humanistic aspirations? How do we make literature a gateway to philosophy? What books are particularly apt for this at various stages of a child's development? How do we teach science in a way that is respectable and rigorous, and yet does not lead to the students to the ineluctable reductionist conclusion that science is the sole authority for the knowledge of nature, or the only form of thinking worthy of the name of knowledge? How do we as teachers deepen our own understanding of the tradition, since so few of us have received the kinds of educations we hope to give them? You will undoubtedly discuss many other interesting issues here and learn, hopefully, new and helpful tricks of the trade. But as you embark on these discussions, please don't forget the signs that left to us by C.S. Lewis and Plato. Please do not forget what it is that makes Catholic liberal education true education in the first place. And please do not lose sight of the true goal of this entire effort: to help our children acquire the desire, the imagination, and the vision to see beyond the shadows of the darkening cave and to live as Narnians. That's what real education is and has always been about. That is the truth that will set them free, and especially now, as much or more than ever, their freedom depends on it. Thank you.